Inside the grand hall, as soon as Lu Tiandao's unceremonious voice echoed, the room immediately fell into a dead silence. The others, like Jiu, shot him angry glances. If it weren't for their hesitation due to Lu Tiandao's status, they probably would have already risen to argue in Mu Chen's defense. However, compared to their righteous indignation, Mu Chen remained calm, his expression neutral, showing no signs of joy or anger. Clearly, he was not surprised by Lu Tiandao's opposition. After all, there had been past grudges between them. Most likely, Lu Tiandao's fury stemmed from an inner sense of imbalance. The other four Earth Supremes, though still silent, seemed to share the same thoughts as Lu Tiandao. They simply hid their feelings deeper, unwilling to be the first to speak out. Nonetheless, it was clear that the five of them did not recognize Mu Chen's position and did not believe he was qualified to be above them. Therefore, if Mu Chen truly wanted to secure this position, even with Mandala's support, he would need to rely on his own strength to intimidate these five powerful individuals. Otherwise, this newly established force would remain on shaky ground and fail to grow. Knowing this, Mandala remained silent after hearing Lu Tiandao's words. Her demeanor clearly indicated that she expected Mu Chen to resolve this matter himself. Upon seeing her attitude, Lu Tiandao and the five Earth Supremes understood immediately and cast aside any remaining reservations. Under the provocation and defiance in their gazes, Mu Chen smiled slightly. He looked up at Lu Tiandao and spoke in a calm tone. If Elder Lu believes I'm unqualified, then what exactly determines this qualification? Lu Tiandao raised his eyelids and, in a slow and deliberate manner, replied, to become someone above others, you must win the people's approval. But winning approval doesn't come from words. It comes from one's strength. Although you, Mu Chen, have broken through to the lower Earth Supreme realm, your experience is still lacking, and your foundation is unstable. If you wish to surpass the five of us, even if we accept you, your subordinates would surely protest, and that could lead to chaos. Lu Tiandao clearly was an old fox. His indifferent tone directly shut down the conversation and shifted the blame onto their subordinates. Mu Chen smiled and nodded, then turned to the Lord of the Netherworld Palace and the other four Earth Supremes. I suppose you four think the same? The ancestor of 10,000 saints and the other three smiled and spoke leisurely. Though young brother Mu has made a remarkable leap, it is true that his experience is still somewhat shallow. That it may be difficult to win the approval of others. Though they didn't quite agree with Mu Chen's rise, they did not want to offend him. After all, a young lower Earth Supreme like him was rare, and his potential was certainly extraordinary. They might one day be surpassed by him. Therefore, these former powerhouses of the Northern Realm addressed him with great courtesy. Mu Chen smiled faintly. So-called qualification and experience. It's all about whose fist is bigger and harder, isn't it? His words were blunt, lacking the subtlety of the older generation. Lu Tiandao and the others simply smiled faintly, not bothering to retort, their thoughts clear. Let this young one understand this. Mu Chen's hand rested on the table, and he smiled again. But in his dark eyes, a sharp, decisive gleam swiftly formed. Slowly, he said, if that's the case, I wonder which of the five of you would like to try my fist and see if it's hard or soft. As soon as Mu Chen finished speaking, a storm of spiritual pressure erupted, and a terrifying wave of energy swept from his body, crashing through the hall like a violent wind. The space around him rippled and distorted, as if it were water. The people sitting behind Mu Chen, like Jiu, the Sleeping King, and the Heavenly Vulture Emperor, all felt their bodies stiffen, as though they were being crushed by a mountain. They couldn't even move. This made them silently marvel at the vast difference between a ninth-grade Supreme and an Earth Supreme. The terrifying spiritual pressure spread across the hall, and Lu Tiandao and the other five Earth Supremes narrowed their eyes. Their robes fluttered without wind, and the spiritual light around them flickered as they formed an invisible shield to block the overwhelming pressure from Mu Chen. Heh, young brother Mu is indeed full of sharpness. Lu Tiandao smiled lightly, then flicked his sleeve and said, but since you seem intent on this, I'd truly like to see for myself. He knew that Mu Chen was no ordinary person, but he was equally confident in his own abilities. After all, he had been in the lower Earth Supreme realm for many years, while Mu Chen had only been there for a few months. This gave him enough confidence to suppress Mu Chen's sharpness that, of course, being cautious, he didn't have the intention of completely crushing Mu Chen. As long as he could slightly diminish Mu Chen's sharpness, he could make him clearly understand that, relying solely on his own strength, he would not be able to suppress people like them. "I wonder how you intend to test me," Lu Tiandao said, his imposing aura radiating. From his expression, it was clear that he was eager to have a real battle with Mu Chen. Such a fight would not only suppress Mu Chen's sharpness, but also elevate his status in the Northern Realm Alliance. Seeing Lu Tiandao's eyes glowing with spiritual light and his aggressive aura, Mu Chen gently flicked his long fingers and smiled. Such a grand battle, while indeed real, wouldn't be very satisfying. Both were at the lower Earth Supreme Realm, and if they truly fought to the death, the winner would be determined by life or death combat. That was clearly not what Mu Chen wanted to see. After all, if he became the top figure, he certainly wouldn't want to lose a key general right away. Super powerful figures like Lu Tiandao were not easy to come by. They were far from being like cabbages that anyone could pick up. Lu Tiandao took Mu Chen's words as a sign of lacking confidence, and immediately said indifferently, "No matter the kind of confrontation, I can handle it." Mu Chen smiled slightly and stretched out his hand. Spiritual light gathered in his palm as he softly spoke. "Since Elder Lu is so confident, how about this? I'll set up an array, and if you can last an hour within it, I'll admit defeat and acknowledge you as the leader." Suddenly, the hall was filled with astonished murmurs. They couldn't believe what they had just heard. They knew Mu Chen was skilled in spirit arrays, but could he really have mastered it to the Grandmaster level? Even a true initial grade Grandmaster spirit array could at most trap Lu Tiandao, let alone have him endure for an hour. That was utterly laughable. At that level, the spirit array was likely nearing the intermediate Grandmaster level. Even an Upper Earth Supreme would struggle with such an array. Mu Chen was being far too arrogant, wasn't he? Truly unaware of his own limitations. Lu Tiandao chuckled in anger. He hadn't expected Mu Chen to be so arrogant. However, he secretly felt pleased by the latter's words. Once Mu Chen lost, he would lose all hope of ascending to the top, and any plan the mandala had to support him would be dashed. In contrast, Lu Tiandao could rise by seizing the opportunity. He might even be able to eye the position of the new leader, especially since Mandala didn't seem particularly interested in that position. "Since young brother Mu speaks so boldly, I will teach you a lesson today that let's see what makes your spirit array so extraordinary," Lu Tiandao said with a cold laugh, standing with his hands behind his back. Mu Chen smiled and nodded. He no longer said anything unnecessary. With a wave of his sleeve, countless spiritual seals flew out like rivers of stars. The seals merged into the void, causing space to ripple. Lines of spiritual energy spread outward, intersecting and forming intricate, obscure patterns. In just a few dozen breaths, a massive spirit array took shape in the air above the hall. Spiritual energy from the heavens and earth surged, all gathering into the array. Roar. Within the array, a faint dragon's roar echoed, and an unusual pressure spread outward. Seeing the gigantic array in midair, Lu Tiandao and his 5 companions couldn't help but stare in awe. This array had clearly reached the true Grandmaster level. No wonder Mu Chen had been so bold. It turned out he truly had such abilities, which was quite a surprise. Roar. Within the enormous array, the spiritual energy churned like a tide, and then 3 massive dragons materialized. They coiled in the air, exuding immense pressure. With Mu Chen's current strength, the 9 dragons slaying Immortal array he set up was clearly far more powerful than before. "This spirit array does have some merit," Lu Tiandao said. Looking up at the vast array, he smiled faintly and stepped forward, entering the array. "But if this is all, I can break it." He could immediately tell that while this spirit array was indeed somewhat mysterious, it was far from being a threat to him. Furthermore, this array seems to have many flaws. It's clearly an incomplete array. "If you think you can make me surrender with a broken array, you're probably being a bit too naive," Lu Tiandao said indifferently to Mu Chen. Upon hearing this, Mu Chen smiled lightly and nodded. Lu Tiandao indeed had some insight, and could tell that the 9 dragons slaying Immortal array before them was only a partial array. In that case, Mu Chen smiled faintly, his expression inscrutable, as he formed a hand seal. Then let me show you the complete form of this 9 dragons slaying immortal array. Buzz. As soon as Mu Chen formed the seal, a thunderous roar erupted from the massive spirit array in midair. Immediately, visible lines of spiritual energy began to spread out, intertwining and connecting. With each connection of these energy lines, everyone could feel the incompleteness of the array being rapidly repaired, and at the same time, a growing and terrifying spiritual energy fluctuation surged, gathering like a storm within the array. Luo Li also noticed this change. His gaze sharpened, and he didn't dare to underestimate Mu Chen. Vast spiritual energy immediately began to gather around him, forming a layer of armor made of spiritual energy, resembling precious gemstones. This armor, made of pure spiritual energy, was not only indestructible, but also highly adaptable. Any spiritual energy attack that struck it would be partially absorbed by the armor, reducing the damage that it was extremely practical. Roar. However, Mu Chen ignored his movements. With a change of his seal, another deafening dragon's roar resonated through the 9 dragons slaying immortal array. Within the array, surging spiritual energy gathered like torrents of water, and soon, a massive dragon rapidly took shape from the array. Now, for giant dragons coiled within the array, their eyes fixed on Luo Li, releasing wave after wave of oppressive force. Luo Li's face became more serious as he observed the 4 dragons that he could clearly feel that when the 4th dragon took shape, the pressure from the array had nearly doubled. If he was confident in facing the 3 dragons earlier, now, his confidence had dropped to about 50%. This Mu Chen actually has some real skill, Luo Li muttered to himself. But just at that moment, he saw Mu Chen smiling again, forming another hand seal. This sight made his pupils contract. Could it be that it's not over yet? Roar. Just as that thought crossed his mind, another dragon's roar reverberated through the array, and millions of spiritual light beams exploded outward. In the light, another giant dragon formed. Now, within the 9 dragons slaying immortal array, there were 5 giant dragons. At this moment, Luo Li's face truly turned grim, and even the observing lord of the Netherworld Palace, sage of 10,000 saints, and others all had their expressions turned serious. Clearly, they could sense a faint trace of danger emanating from the array of 5 dragons. The spirit array before them was now strong enough to pose a threat. Luo Li's mouth twitched slightly. If he were in a life-and-death battle with Mu Chen right now, he would have already made a move without hesitation, not allowing Mu Chen to continue enhancing the array. But unfortunately, the bet between him and Mu Chen was based on whether he could endure within the array for an hour. Since that was the case, he could only watch as Mu Chen continued to activate the array to its fullest. This should be his limit. Luo Li suppressed the unease in his heart, trying to comfort himself. According to his estimation, if Mu Chen created another spiritual energy dragon, he would truly be trapped in the array. It seemed as though Mu Chen noticed Luo Li's self-comfort, as he looked up and smiled at the latter. Upon seeing his smile, Luo Li felt a chill run down his spine. Then, with his face turning ashen, he saw Mu Chen forming another seal. Buzz. Countless rays of spiritual energy interwove within the spirit array, tracing obscure paths. Each ray worked to repair the original flaws of the array, gradually erasing its imperfections, piece by piece. Boom! At this moment, the spiritual energy within the realm suddenly surged, as though drawn by some force, continuously pouring into the 9 dragons slaying immortal arrayed. As this vast spiritual power flowed in, everyone felt their eyelids twitch. Once again, a giant spiritual energy dragon swiftly took shape. 6 now. The lord of the Netherworld Palace and the others exchanged glances, unable to suppress a gulp. The thin sheen of sweat appeared on their foreheads. At that moment, they could clearly sense a terrifying wave of power erupting from the spirit array in front of them. One so fierce that even they dared not take it lightly. An array of this magnitude was not something they would dare to enter recklessly. They glanced covertly at Luo Li, whose face was ashen, and inwardly breathed a sigh of relief. They were glad they hadn't been the first to act, or else they would be in a difficult position right now. Didn't expect you to be able to set up an array of this level. Truly, the old waves push the new ones forward. Fine, today I will see just how much power this array of yours truly holds. Lu Tiandao's gaze flickered. He stared at the impressive spirit array, then suddenly let out a loud roar. Stepping forward, he clasped his hands together, and vast spiritual energy gathered in his palms, transforming into a 1,000-foot-long spiritual whip. He swung it fiercely, tearing through the void like lightning, aiming directly at the 6 spiritual energy dragons. Lu Tiandao's sudden move instantly enraged the 9 Nether and others. This old man was truly sly. Seeing Mu Chen's array growing stronger, he could no longer sit idly by. Instead, he chose to strike, hoping to disrupt Mu Chen's progress. Seeing Lu Tiandao's actions, Mu Chen merely smiled faintly. If this old fox thought such a move would stop him from continuing the 9 dragons slaying Immortal array, then he greatly underestimated him. With that thought, Mu Chen flicked his fingers. Instantly, the 9 dragons slaying Immortal array exploded with a dazzling spiritual light. The array activated, and the 6 spiritual energy dragons roared. Their mouths opened wide, releasing 6 immense dragon breaths that enveloped the area, completely blocking Lu Tiandao's attack. Boom! Boom! The battle between the two unleashed a chaotic storm of spiritual energy, shattering the space around them. If not for Mandala intervening, this grand hall would likely have been pulverized by the residual shockwaves in an instant. Within the vast spirit array, countless rays of spiritual light continued to burst forth in just a few dozen breaths. Lu Tiandao had exchanged hundreds of blows with the 6 dragons. Yet, despite exerting all his strength, he still couldn't shake the 6 dragons even the slightest. He could only maintain his own position without falling. This kid's array is actually this powerful. This exchange left Lu Tiandao deeply shocked. He realized that even when using all his might, he could not break through the blockade of the 6 spiritual energy dragons. This meant that the array now had the power to trap a lower Earth Supreme. After the exchange, Lu Tiandao understood that, unless he fully unleashed all his methods, he would never break the array. With this realization, he abandoned any hope of breaking the array and switched to a defensive stance. After all, what Mu Chen had said earlier was just for him to last for an hour in the array. Although Lu Tiandao could not deal with the mysterious array before him, he also discovered that the array couldn't break through his defenses. In this case, as long as he could stall, he would surely be able to drag out the hour. Such a tactic might not be the most honorable, but since Mu Chen had spoken so arrogantly before, Lu Tiandao decided to use this as a lesson for the youngster. With these thoughts in mind, Lu Tiandao stopped caring. His vast spiritual power surged, and millions of rays of spiritual light surrounded him, forming an unshakable defense. No matter how the 6 dragons attacked, he remained unyielding. This old man really has no shame. Behind Mu Chen, 9 Nether and the others shook their heads in dismay, unable to help but mutter in their hearts. The Lord of the Netherworld Palace and the others also secretly sneered, but said nothing. After all, if Lu Tiandao won, they wouldn't have to acknowledge Mu Chen as their leader. So, let this victory by any means old man handle it. Of course, they couldn't help but feel a little relieved inside, thankful they didn't make a move. Otherwise, the one in the awkward position that Lu Tiandao was in now would have been them. Inside the grand hall, everyone's emotions were mixed at Mu Chen, however, still smiled as he watched Lu Tiandao, who had fully switched to a defensive stance. A slight, mocking curve appeared at the corner of his lips. At the same time, he extended his long hands and pressed them together, forming an ancient seal. The moment the seal was completed, the boundless fire domain burst forth with overwhelming light once again. But on the other side, spiritual energy gathered, and faintly, the shadow of a giant dragon began to take shape. This sudden commotion caught everyone's attention instantly. Many of the strong experts turned pale. No one had expected that while Mu Chen was dealing with Lu Tiandao, he could still focus on perfecting the spirit array at the same time. Moreover, the spirit array had not yet reached its limit. What level of spirit array was this? As everyone was in shock, Lu Tiandao also noticed the seventh dragon image gradually taking form. His face immediately became extremely grim. He could sense that with the formation of the seventh dragon, the spirit array seemed to be growing more terrifying. He had a bad premonition. Once the seventh dragon joined, he would truly be unable to withstand it. Boom, boom. Realizing this, Lu Tiandao no longer held back. His vast spiritual energy erupted, forming into a gigantic supreme Dharma form behind him. As the form opened its mouth, a powerful ocean surged forth, slamming the 6 giant dragons away. Roar! At that moment, a deep, resonant dragon's roar echoed through the heavens and earth. Endless spiritual light erupted, and the 7th giant spiritual dragon materialized from the 9 dragons, slaying Immortal array. It howled to the sky, transforming into a pillar of light and shooting forward. Whoosh! Whoosh! The other 6 spiritual dragons also turned into beams of light, merging with the 7th dragon. In an instant, the 7 dragons converged. The light flickered unpredictably before suddenly a massive, dragon-scaled light will shot out, tearing through the void. It sped towards Lu Tiandao with lightning speed, amid the shocked gazes of the onlookers. Looking at the dragon-scaled light will filled with destructive waves, Lu Tiandao's face turned pale. A look of horror appeared on his face. Finally, unable to withstand the pressure, he gritted his teeth and shouted, "I admit defeat. I admit defeat." When Lu Tiandao's voice rang out, the dragon-scaled light wheel, carrying destructive power, trembled violently. Just a few feet from Lu Tiandao's face, it suddenly exploded into countless light points, scattering in all directions. The overwhelming spiritual energy light points swept across, but they still sent Lu Tiandao flying backward. His body's spiritual energy armor, almost solid in form, was also forcibly repelled. Lu Tiandao's body was sent flying thousands of feet before he finally stopped himself. That he stood in the air, his expression shifting constantly before finally turning to a look of dejection. He flew back to the grand hall. The hall fell silent. The lord of the Netherworld Palace and others exchanged glances, their eyes filled with undisguised shock. This scene was clearly beyond their expectations. They had never underestimated Mu Chen, knowing he had many means at his disposal. Even if Lu Tiandao made a move, they hadn't expected him to defeat Mu Chen. Their hope had been for Lu Tiandao to display his strength, at least to remain undefeated, and slightly dampen Mu Chen's momentum. That way, Mu Chen would be unable to take the position. But who could have predicted that Mu Chen had no intention of making a move? He had only set up a spirit array, which had forced Lu Tiandao to admit defeat in utter disgrace. Mu Chen has actually grown this strong, they murmured, feeling uneasy. Just a few years ago, Mu Chen was nothing but a nameless pawn in the great Luo Heaven domain. Yet now, just a few years later, he had surpassed them. Such a rapid growth rate was truly shocking. It was hard to imagine where this young man could go with more time. While their minds were racing, Mu Chen smiled gently, looking at Lu Tiandao, whose expression was still fluctuating. He spoke in a soft voice. "Lu Lao, don't take it to heart. I won this battle through a clever trick. After all, if it were a life-or-death fight, no one would just sit and wait for a spirit array master to finish setting up their formation before attacking." When Lu Tiandao saw Mu Chen had won and did not display any arrogance or mockery, but instead actively gave him face and a way out, his ever-changing old face softened, and for the first time, he felt some respect for Mu Chen in his heart. This young man in front of him was a true prodigy, not to be judged by common standards. Now that he had lost to him, it wasn't entirely without reason. With a helpless sigh, he said, "The waves pushed the old ones aside that I must admit. I overestimated myself to dive. Got to hand it to you, young Mo." Seeing Lu Tiandao yielding, the lord of the Netherworld Palace and the others exchanged glances and could only sigh inwardly, knowing that Mu Chen's rise to power was now unshakable. But thankfully, Mu Chen's earlier move not only intimidated Lu Tiandao, but also shook them all. After all, their strength was on par with Lu Tiandao's. Since Mu Chen had forced Lu Tiandao to admit defeat, even if they intervened, the outcome wouldn't change. In this world, power was still the ultimate authority. If Mu Chen could defeat them, it proved his qualifications. Mandala, who had been silent all along, smiled and asked, "Since that's the case, does anyone have any objections to my earlier proposal?" The group fell silent and eventually shook their heads at this point. Opposing her would clearly be self-degrading. Slap. Mandala clapped her small hands and smiled brightly. "In that case, I hereby announce that Mu Chen will become the leader of the newly established force. We shall all follow his will from now on." Lu Tiandao, the lord of the Netherworld Palace, and the others looked at Mu Chen, nodding respectfully in submission. Lu Tiandao, ever the gentleman, looked at Mu Chen and Mandala and asked, "Since we're forming a new force, what should we call it?" Seeing this, it was clear that Mandala wanted to break away from the restrictions of the Northern Realm Alliance. That as such, she likely wouldn't use the old name. Otherwise, it would be hard to move on and fully integrate change the atmosphere. It was only fitting to discard the past. Mu Chen, hearing this, looked at Mandala and thought for a moment before saying, "We will use the ancient Heavenly Palace as our foundation. How about calling it the Ancient Heavenly Palace?" It was clear that he intended to leave something for the Heavenly Emperor, as he owed him a great deal. However, Mandala gently shook her head and said, "The Heavenly Emperor has already said that the ancient Heavenly Palace is part of history and should not be forced to survive. Let its former glory go with him." Mu Chen was stunned for a moment, then nodded. Mandala clearly had feelings for the ancient Heavenly Palace, but times had changed. Retaining the name would only stir up sorrow. "Well," Mu Chen, seemingly indifferent, scratched his head. Mandala propped her chin with her hand, her eyes twinkling. Then, she clapped her hands and smiled brightly. "I've got it. Since this new force will be led by you, let's simply call it Mu Manor. Simple and to the point." Mu Chen's face instantly broke into a cold sweat, as expected. It was blunt and direct. Lu Tiandao and the others exchanged glances, hesitated, and whispered, "Isn't this a bit too much?" The name was too distinctive. Once established, it would undoubtedly brand them with a clear label, one that clearly belonged to Mu Chen. For those who had always been proud and independent, it was hard to accept. Hearing their words, Mandala's expression darkened. She said coldly, "Do you still have objections at this point? If you don't wanna, you are free to leave. But don't regret it in the future." Seeing Mandala's icy tone, Lu Tiandao and the others shuddered. After a moment, they gritted their teeth and shook their heads. "In that case, let it be called Mu Manor." At their level, to improve themselves required immense resources. Though they could be the leaders of the northern domain, in a supercontinent like Tianluo, they could only protect their small territory. Once they left the northern domain, they would have to be extremely cautious, for offending top powers in Tianluo continent would bring great trouble in this vast world. Having a powerful background can smooth the path of cultivation, saving one from many troubles. The Mu Manor, although newly established, holds significant potential. Mandala is a genuine Earth Supreme with a perfect cultivation base, a strength that ranks among the top across the entire Tianluo continent. This alone can protect the growth of Mu Manor. Moreover, there is Mu Chen, this young man, who is hard to see through. Though he is currently only at the lower Earth Supreme realm, with his exceptional talent, as long as he does not fall, he is bound to become a renowned figure in the Great Thousand Worlds in the future. At that time, the so-called Mu Manor will likely become a superpower in the Great Thousand Worlds, rivaling the boundless Fire Domain, Martial Realm, and more. After considering everything, Lu Tiandao and the others let go of their concerns. They could see that Mandala clearly intended to establish a solid foundation for Mu Chen's power. Since that is the case, they would no longer treat the Northern Realm Alliance as a mere stepping stone as they had before. They would sincerely join, to see just how far Mu Manor could go. Mandala saw that they finally agreed, and nodded in satisfaction. That he then said, "Since it's settled, 3 days from now will be the day Mu Manor opens its gates and establishes its hall. You will all be the elders of Mu Manor, and no matter how far Mu Manor goes in the future, this is an unchangeable fact." Mandala's words served as reassurance to Lu Tiandao and the others, confirming their positions in Mu Manor, which would not change as the manor grew stronger. Lu Tiandao and the others stood up and bowed solemnly to Mu Chen, positioning themselves as subordinates. Mu Chen, of course, did not dare to be negligent and returned the gesture with a serious bow. Once all matters were settled, Lu Tiandao and the others took their leave. They needed to return to their respective sects and announce this news, which would surely cause some ripples. However, with their influence, they could naturally suppress any backlash. Mu Chen watched their departing figures and breathed a sigh of relief. He then gave Mandala a helpless smile and said, "This position is still better suited to you." Mandala stretched lazily and replied casually, "One day, you'll surpass me. When that time comes, Mu Manor will truly stand tall in the great thousand worlds." Mu Chen smiled wryly and said, "By that time, I may have been driven mad." Just dealing with today's matters was already quite a headache. He couldn't even imagine how annoying it would be once the manor officially opened and all the issues piled up. Speaking of the Nine Nether Palace, you once took charge, but isn't it growing stronger and stronger now? Mandala rolled his eyes and teased that Mu Chen felt embarrassed. The Nine Nether Palace had been entirely managed by Tang Bing, the great steward. He had hardly interfered at all. However, he understood Mandala's point. Sometimes it was best to be a hands-off manager, letting others handle the problems. With this in mind, he relaxed a bit. His expression becoming more serious and urgent, he stared intently at Mandala, took a deep breath, and his voice trembled slightly. "Then, can you tell me about Luo Li now?" In the grand hall, Mu Chen's eyes were fixed on Mandala, his trembling hands revealing the unstable emotions within him. He could never forget the time at Northern Heaven Spiritual Academy when that old, mighty figure took Luo Li away, leaving him feeling powerless and weak. He also couldn't forget the heartbreaking sadness and reluctance in her eyes when she turned around to leave. And yet, he had no ability to stop it. He could only watch her go. He knew that this parting would last for many years. "Next time, I won't let anyone take you from me, no one will." The boy's unwavering voice, so firm and resolute, still echoed clearly in his mind. Since that day, he had left the ivory tower-like Northern Heaven Spiritual Academy and journeyed far to enter the real great thousand worlds. Years passed, and the once youthful boy had become increasingly tall and sturdy. Repeated life and death trials had eroded the childishness from his youthful face, yet his pair of pitch-black eyes remained as firm as ever. After several years, the boy had undergone numerous transformations between life and death. Now, the fledgling eagle of the past had finally earned the right to spread its wings and soar. He was no longer the weak boy he once was. Even now, standing once again before the Luo heavenly god, Mu Chen no longer felt any fear at present. If he truly unleashed all of his hidden cards, even a true Upper Earth Supreme would be left pale in comparison. The years of tempering had ultimately forged the once young boy into someone capable of standing before the elderly figure who had once seemed unshakable, unmovable as a mountain. Of course, he knew that his growth was not meant to challenge the elderly man, who also cared deeply for Luo Li. Rather, he wished to show him that the man his granddaughter chose was not an ordinary stone, but a diamond that would shine brightly after shedding its rough exterior. And for that day, he had worked tirelessly. Mu Chen took a deep breath, and the turmoil in his heart gradually settled. However, his pitch-black eyes grew even brighter and more dazzling. Mandala, observing Mu Chen now exuding a sharp aura, raised her slender eyebrows slightly, then smiled and said, "It seems that the little sweetheart is really important to you." Having known Mu Chen for many years, it was the first time Mandala had seen him so emotionally stirred because of a girl. Mu Chen, hearing this, smiled a little awkwardly, but his gaze remained fixed on Mandala. Noticing his look, Mandala retracted her teasing and gently rubbed her smooth chin before asking, "How much do you know about the Luo God clan?" Mu Chen was momentarily stunned, then shook his head. In the past, he had seen the Luo God clan as unreachable and overwhelmingly powerful. But now, his perspective had changed. Based on his current estimation, the power of the Luo God clan might only be on par with one of the top forces on the Tianluo continent. The Luo God clan has fallen considerably now, but in its peak years, the Luo God clan was beyond your imagination, Mandala said softly. In the ancient era, during the peak of the Luo God clan, A peerless figure emerged. If we're talking about power and fame, even the Heavenly Emperor would have been overshadowed by her. She continued. Chen's face revealed a hint of shock. The Luo God clan had produced such a person. Even the Heavenly Emperor had been inferior to her. Mandala clicked her tongue in admiration. That person, in the ancient era, was known as Luo Shun. Not only was she one of the top powerful figures in the Great Thousand Worlds, but she was also the most beautiful woman in the ancient era. TSK, it said that countless heavenly supremes and prodigies bowed before her beauty. Her name still echoes throughout history. Mu Chun was dumbfounded. He had never expected that the Luo God clan had once produced the most beautiful woman in the Great Thousand Worlds. The Luo God clan has an incredibly ancient heritage. If it weren't for that great calamity with the extraterritorial clan, the Luo God clan might have joined the ranks of the ancient clans today, Mandala said with regret. Mu Chun clicked his tongue. In the Great Thousand Worlds, only the oldest clans could be considered ancient clans, like the Mo Ancient clan and the Fuda Ancient clan. He hadn't expected that the Luo God clan also had such deep roots. Did Luo Shun fall in the end? Mu Chun asked quietly. Mandala nodded slightly, her face serious as she spoke. It said that during the Great Battle, Luo Shun single-handedly stopped 2 heavenly demon emperors of the extraterritorial clan. These 2 heavenly demon emperors ranked 8th and 9th in the extraterritorial clan. Mu Chun's gaze sharpened. According to the classification in the extraterritorial clan, those 2 heavenly demon emperors were ranked as the 8th and 9th most powerful figures. They were definitely extraordinary beings. After all, in the ancient heavenly palace, he had already witnessed the power of the 9 corpses heavenly demon emperor and knew just how terrifying those heavenly demon emperors who held rankings in the extraterritorial clan could be. Yet Luo Shun had fought them both alone. What courage and danger that must have entailed. In that battle, Luo Shun fell, but the 2 ranked heavenly demon emperors were left with 1 dead and 1 injured. Mandala sighed, speaking with deep admiration for the once most beautiful woman in the Great Thousand Worlds. Mu Chun was also deeply shocked by the results. After all, even the Heavenly Emperor had to exert his full strength just to seal the 9 corpses Heavenly Demon Emperor, while Luo Shun was able to fight to the death, leaving 1 injured and 1 dead. This was enough to prove that what Mandala had said earlier about Luo Shun's strength and reputation was indeed true, surpassing even the Heavenly Emperor. As for Luo Shun's fall, she transformed into an endless river, named the Luo River. The Luo God clan has guarded it ever since. That it is said that Luo Shun left behind an inheritance, one part of which is the legendary Luo Shun divine body, famous across the Great Thousand Worlds. The Luo Shun divine body ranks 11th on the Supreme Dharmakaya ranking. Mu Chun was finally moved. He never expected that this exceptionally mysterious and rare Supreme Dharmakaya would be in the hands of the Luo God clan. Compared to this Luo Shun divine body, even his immortal golden body might not have much of an advantage. At this moment, he realized that he had indeed underestimated the foundations of the Luo God clan. However, Mandala shook her head at this point and said, "Over all these years, no one from the Luo God clan has been able to cultivate the Luo Shun divine body. As for the inheritance left by Luo Shun, no one has encountered it either. Because of this, the Luo God clan has continued to decline until it reached its current state." Mu Chun clicked his tongue again. It seemed that cultivating the Luo Shun divine body was truly not an easy task. No wonder no one had heard of anyone cultivating this kind of Dharmakaya over the years. They have weakened and yet possess a treasure. Naturally, it would attract envy. Mandala said indifferently. In the Western Heaven realm, there are 4 great divine clans: the Luo God clan, the Blood God clan, the Titan God clan, and the Bone God clan. Although the Luo God clan had weakened in the past, they were still considered the strongest of the 4, for even a dying camel is bigger than a horse. But as the other 3 clans gradually rose, the Luo God clan's prestige continued to decline. Now, the strongest force in the Western Heaven realm has been overtaken by the Blood God clan. There is a great enmity between the Blood God clan and the Luo God clan, with centuries of friction and deep hatred. Using their growing power, the the Blood God clan has relentlessly pressured the Luo God clan, causing them to struggle for breath and fall into a wretched state. The Luo God clan itself is also very disorganized in this crisis. The situation is unstable, each faction is acting on its own, and they are now facing the threat of extinction. At this point, Mandala looked at Mu Chun with a smile and said, "But your little lover is quite capable to in the years since her return. She has managed to stabilize the clan's internal turmoil by relying on her own strength, and she has allowed the Luo God clan to survive the Blood God clan's relentless pursuit. She has extended their lifespan for a while." Mu Chun heard this, but there was no joy on his face. Instead, his hands clenched tightly within his sleeves, his expression cold. Even though he wasn't by Luo Li's side, he could still feel the burden she had endured to stabilize the Luo God clan's unstable situation, and how much humiliation and suffering she had to silently endure. "How is she now? You mentioned that her condition was very bad." Mu Chen took a deep breath and asked in a low voice that Mandala's small face also grew serious as she nodded gently, saying, "According to the information I've received, Luo Tianshun is planning to hold the Luo Shen ceremony for her, an attempt to unlock the Luo Shen inheritance. If Luo Li really manages to obtain the Luo Shen inheritance and cultivate the Luo Shen divine body, with her talent, she will likely become another Luo Shen in the future. Such an event is not something the other three clans of the Western Heaven Realm would want to see. Therefore, this Luo Shen ceremony is bound to encounter difficulties. Furthermore, I've heard that there are many problems within the Luo God clan. Not everyone supports your little lover. After all, her direct bloodline is already very weak, and if anything happens to Luo Tianshun, this Luo Shen ceremony might not be easy." Mu Chen's eyes flickered with cold light as he took a deep breath, suppressing the emotions within him. His voice was deep as he asked, "When will the Luo Shen ceremony start?" "1 month from now." Mu Chen looked at Mandala and asked, "Can I use the power of Mu Manor? The Luo Shen ceremony involves so much, and people from all over will gather." Even though he had already reached the Earth's supreme realm, with just his own strength, he would likely be limited. Mandala smiled lightly and stood up. "You're the master of Mu Manor now. What do you think?" Mu Chen whispered, "Thank you." He naturally knew that Mandala had abandoned the Northern Realm Alliance and built Mu Manor for him, placing him at the helm. Mandala stretched lazily, but her words carried an imposing tone. "Who told you to be my little junior brother? No one dares to bully our sister-in-law, and if they do, we'll beat them to death." Mu Chen grinned, but a hint of fierce light flickered in his pitch-black eyes. "Luo Li, wait for me."